In the medieval world, there was no such thing as a private sex life. Every intimate act, every hidden desire, fell under the watchful gaze of a supreme authority, the Catholic Church. During an era when religious belief permeated every breath of daily life, the Church did not merely guide souls toward salvation. It extended its powerful hand into the very bedrooms of the faithful, defining what was virtuous and what was sinful. This control was not a matter of vague admonitions, but a sophisticated, deeply entrenched system, rooted in a specific theological vision of humanity's fallen nature. To understand the sheer scale of this intrusion, one must begin with the foundational belief that shaped it, the doctrine of original sin. According to the teachings of church fathers like St. Augustine, the very act of sexual intercourse, even within marriage, was inextricably linked to the fall of Adam and Eve. It was the mechanism through which sin was transmitted from one generation to the next. Passion, pleasure, and even a momentary loss of rational control were seen as evidence of humanity's corrupted state. This perspective did not make sex evil in itself. It was a necessary evil for the propagation of the human race, but it framed it as something inherently dangerous, a chaotic force that constantly threatened to overwhelm the soul unless strictly disciplined and contained. The primary institution created to discipline this force was marriage. In the eyes of the Church, matrimony was not primarily about love, companionship, or even personal fulfillment. It was a sacrament designed to channel base animal instincts into a socially and spiritually useful purpose: procreation. This was the only context in which sexual activity was granted a grudging legitimacy. Theologians debated the exact moment a marriage was consummated, not out of curiosity, but because it was the pivotal event that sealed an unbreakable holy bond. However, even within this sacred union, the rules were stringent and specific. The concept of conjugal debt meant that spouses were obligated to fulfill each other's sexual needs to prevent the sin of fornication or adultery, but they were forbidden from taking any pleasure in it. The ideal was a dispassionate, purposeful act aimed solely at creating children. Any deviation from this procreative goal was considered a transgression. Positions other than the missionary position were often frowned upon, as they were believed to be associated with non-procreative pleasure, and thus, with sin. This created a paradoxical reality for medieval couples. They were commanded by religious law to engage in an act that was simultaneously deemed a manifestation of humanity's spiritual failure. Beyond the confines of licit marital relations lay a vast and terrifying landscape of sin. The Church, through its theologians and canon lawyers, became obsessed with cataloging and classifying every possible sexual transgression, creating a detailed taxonomy of vice. Adultery was a grave sin against the sacrament of marriage, but it was just one entry in a long list. Fornication between unmarried individuals was a serious offense, but the most severe condemnations were reserved for acts that were seen as completely divorcing sex from its procreative function. Homosexuality, or sodomy, as it was broadly termed, was considered a crime against nature and was punishable by severe penances, social ostracism, and in later centuries, death by burning. Masturbation was likewise condemned as a sterile and selfish act, a wasteful spilling of seed that violated the natural order. The Church's gaze even extended to the timing of intimacy. Intercourse was forbidden on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, during pregnancy, and for a period after childbirth, effectively rendering large portions of the year off limits. This complex web of restrictions meant that a devout medieval Christian could scarcely contemplate, let alone engage in, any sexual act without first navigating a labyrinth of potential sins. The message was clear: the body and its desires were the enemy of the soul, and only through the rigid control imposed by the Church could one hope to achieve salvation. This was not merely a set of abstract ideas, it was a worldview that shaped the deepest anxieties and most private moments of millions of people for centuries. To enforce this intricate web of sexual regulations, the medieval Church developed a formidable and pervasive system of surveillance and discipline that reached into the heart of every parish. The most powerful tool in this arsenal was the sacrament of confession. During the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the Church made annual confession to a priest obligatory for every believer, cementing its role as the guardian of not only public morality but also the most secret thoughts and deeds. This was not the gentle, encouraging confession of modern times. It was a rigorous, intimidating inquisition into the soul. To guide priests in this task, they relied on penitentials, detailed manuals that served as exhaustive catalogues of sins, complete with corresponding penances. These books were shockingly specific. They did not merely list broad categories like lust. They delved into graphic detail, asking about the nature of the act, the participants, the positions, the frequency, and even the thoughts that accompanied it. A priest, acting as a spiritual detective and judge, was expected to interrogate his parishioners, extracting every sordid detail to determine the appropriate severity of the sin. The penance for a confessed transgression could range from days of fasting and prayer to years of pilgrimage, all designed to purge the soul of its impurity through physical hardship and atonement. The regulation of marriage itself became a primary battlefield for the church's control. What had often been a private arrangement between families was systematically brought under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The church insisted that marriages be publicly announced through bans, preventing secret unions, and that they be solemnized by a priest. It defined the complex rules of consanguinity and affinity, prohibiting marriage between distant relatives by blood or marriage, rules so intricate that they could be used to annul politically inconvenient unions. This control over the formation of the family unit was absolute. Once a marriage was consummated, it was considered indissoluble. There was no such thing as divorce in the modern sense. Annulments, a declaration that a valid marriage had never existed, were possible but difficult to obtain, typically reserved for the wealthy and powerful who could navigate the complex and expensive canonical courts. This system trapped countless individuals in unhappy or even abusive relationships, with the church standing as the final, unyielding arbiter of their most fundamental personal bonds. Beyond the confessional and the marriage altar, the church's obsession with sexual purity manifested in some of the most bizarre and controversial practices in history. The concept of chastity belts, while likely more myth than widespread reality, powerfully symbolizes the extreme measures contemplated to enforce fidelity, particularly on women. The imagery of a locked metal device, the key held by an absent crusading husband, encapsulates the deep-seated anxiety about female sexuality and the desire for absolute physical control. More concretely, the Church's war on sodomy intensified over the centuries. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV's papal bull Ad Extirpanda officially permitted the use of torture to extract confessions for heresy, a category that often included sexual deviance. This marked a dark turning point, where spiritual sin became conflated with criminal heresy, justifying horrific physical punishment. The rise of the Inquisition formalized this persecution, turning suspicion of unconventional sexual behavior into a matter of state-sanctioned terror. The system created a culture of constant self-policing and neighborly suspicion, knowing that one's own secrets could be forced out in the confessional, and that any deviation from the norm could be reported to authorities, fostered an atmosphere of pervasive fear and guilt. The human body, with its natural urges and desires, was no longer a private domain but a contested territory, a potential site of demonic influence that had to be constantly monitored, disciplined, and subdued by the unyielding authority of the Church. The psychological and social consequences of this centuries-long campaign of control were profound and enduring. The Church's teachings cultivated a deep-seated culture of shame, fear, and anxiety around the human body and its natural functions. For the ordinary medieval person, sexual thoughts were not merely private distractions but potential gateways to eternal damnation. The constant self-examination required in confession, the detailed cataloguing of impure thoughts and acts, and the threat of severe penance or social ostracism created what modern psychologists might recognize as religious scrupulosity, a pathological guilt and obsession with moral or religious purity. This internalized repression had tangible social effects. It shaped gender dynamics, placing a disproportionate burden of sexual purity on women, whose value was often tied to their virginity before marriage and fidelity within it. It fostered suspicion and hypocrisy, as public adherence to strict morals often masked private transgression. The very language of the body became a language of sin, and the path to holiness was framed as a violent struggle against one's own physical nature. Yet, within this oppressive system lies one of history's great ironies. The very institution that sought to suppress and control sexuality became, through its meticulous record-keeping, the primary source for understanding the intimate lives of medieval people. The penitentials, confessors' guides, Inquisition trial records, and theological summas, while intended for discipline and control, provide an astonishingly detailed window into the private behaviors, anxieties, and desires of a world long past. We learn not just what the authorities prescribed, but what people actually did, thought, and feared. These documents reveal the persistent human resistance to control, the widespread practice of forbidden acts, the creative interpretations of church law, and the enduring power of human passion despite the threat of hellfire. In seeking to eradicate deviant behavior, The church inadvertently created the most comprehensive archive of that very behavior, allowing historians to reconstruct the complex and often contradictory sexual landscape of the Middle Ages with a clarity that would otherwise be impossible. The legacy of the medieval church's control over sexuality extends far beyond the collapse of feudalism or the end of the Inquisition. It laid the foundational bedrock for Western attitudes towards sex, morality, and the body that would echo for centuries. The dichotomies it enforced between sacred procreation and sinful pleasure, between the pure spirit and the corrupt flesh, became deeply embedded in the cultural psyche. The Reformation, while challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, often maintained or even intensified its suspicion of sexuality. The Victorian era, with its own peculiar brand of sexual repression and public prudery, can be seen as a secularized continuation of these medieval anxieties. Even in the modern world, debates surrounding sexual education, reproductive rights, and the boundaries of acceptable sexual expression are often haunted by the ghosts of these ancient theological arguments. The very concept that the state or religious institutions have a legitimate interest in regulating private, consensual sexual behavior is a direct inheritance from the time when the Church declared itself the final arbiter of the bedroom. In the final analysis, the story of the medieval Church's control over sexuality is more than a historical curiosity about strange and oppressive rules. It is a powerful case study of how an institution can seek to shape the most intimate aspects of human existence to serve its own doctrinal and social goals. For over a millennium, the Church did not merely govern kingdoms. It attempted to govern desire itself. It taught generations of Europeans that their bodies were battlefields in a cosmic war between salvation and sin, and that every natural impulse was a potential enemy. While its absolute power has waned, the cultural and psychological frameworks it built of guilt, of shame, of the body as a problem to be managed, proved remarkably resilient. By stepping into the confessional booth of the Middle Ages, we begin to understand not just the past, but the deep, often unexamined roots of our own complex and fraught relationship with sexuality, morality, and the enduring struggle for personal freedom against systems of control. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of power in the medieval world. If you found this exploration of history's intimate battlegrounds fascinating, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more content that uncovers the forgotten truths of our past. Let us know in the comments what other aspects of daily life in history you'd like us to investigate next.